Daniel Klem Jr., quien es profesor de la Universidad de Muhlenberg y es, como he comentado, un pionero en la investigación de la colisión de aves contra ventanas. El doctor Klem nos está transmitiendo desde Allentown, en Pensilvania, y la entrevista que le voy a hacer va a ser más que nada en inglés. Voy a traducir algunas cositas, pero más que nada es en inglés, ¿ok? Entonces, welcome, Dr. Klem. Thanks a lot for being here.
What a privilege and a pleasure it is.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to do, as you know, is we are going to share some pictures and then we are going to discuss about what we are watching, okay? Entonces voy a mostrar sobre todo algunas fotos de las cosas que las personas han compartido a través de la experiencia del proyecto de Aves y Ventanas en Costa Rica. Y pues vamos a retroalimentar un poquito lo que el doctor Klem conoce por su experiencia, ¿ok? So, my first question will be, how did you start studying bird window collisions? Maybe you can share us about that.
Sure. This was when I was a relatively young student in my mid-20s. And I had finished my undergraduate studies and had done a master's degree studies, and I was studying my PhD work at a university in the state of Illinois of the United States of America, at the very bottom of the state, called Southern Illinois University. And one of the professors that I worked for as a teaching assistant, invited me to study birds under his direction. And he introduced me to this idea that birds were being killed flying into windows. And at first I had not heard of this, and I went to a building that he recommended I monitor, and I sat there early in the morning before dark, and just before, as the light started coming in, a mourning dove, a pigeon type bird, flew through the trees and smashed into the windows. And from that experience, I then went and saw other windows around the campus and looked underneath in the vegetation and found evidence of other collisions. And I was hooked, so to speak. I became committed to looking into this. Nobody at that particular time had really, there had been some reports in the literature, but nobody had studied this in a very structured or comprehensive way. And so so the answer to the question is, it was the topic of my doctoral work at school.
Yes. So you say that there were not a lot of people studying that in that time. And I guess it was not considered a very serious problem. And also you mentioned a couple of times before that it was difficult to publish about this subject.
Very much, yes. Yeah. It took about 10 years, really. I mean, there were some papers in the literature going back even to the 1800s where birds had been documented flying into windows, but nobody had looked at this in a really comprehensive way and studied it in a very structural, systematic manner. And so my work was the first to do that. And when I finished, because of the novelty and the really the extravagant loss of life that these birds were experiencing, I thought that it would be easy to get the scientific community to publish my work. But the main scientists that were in charge of these journals, they had not heard of this before, and they didn't really believe me. And so it took quite a while to convince the scientific community that this particular topic was worthy of their attention. They, would say that they thought that the topic was unsuitable. I'm not really sure what that meant, meaning unsuitable, meaning they thought it might have been so minor or such a strange or rare event. But now things have changed dramatically, and more young scientists are like yourself and others are starting to study this in a serious way. And it's heartwarming to see that people are taking it more seriously and trying to protect these bird lives.
Muchas gracias. Voy a traducir un poquito lo que dice el doctor Klem. Él comenzó a estudiar este tema de la colisión de aves contra ventanas cuando era estudiante de doctorado y un profesor le llamó la atención sobre este tema y fue a un lugar donde había escuchado que había colisiones y al poco tiempo de estar allí una paloma golpeó contra la ventana y buscando alrededor encontró otras aves que habían golpeado también. A pesar de que él fue uno de los primeros en estudiar este tema en su momento, fue bastante difícil para él publicar sobre este tema porque muchos de los editores de la revista se encontraban este tema como tal vez muy extraño o tal vez no importante. Le tomó 10 años en llegar a publicar los resultados de su tesis. Okay, Dr. Klem, why birds collide, or maybe also why they die when they collide with windows?
Sure. Well, in addition to collecting information about the incidents, the events that birds fly into windows, I also, in my early studies in the 1970s, designed experiments to ask questions as to whether birds could see glass, whether it was clear glass or whether it was glass that was reflecting the facing habitat and sky. And all of these early experiments, in addition to all the other data that I gathered regarding the accounts of birds flying into windows, indicated that birds just fail to see glass as a barrier. They are deceived by it. They, on a clear window, like in a corridor or a linkway or an atrium or a railing around a building, they're trying to reach the habitat that's visible through a clear window on the other side, and they fly into it. And most windows, however, even perfectly clear windows, when they're covering a darkened room, act like a mirror on the outside, and they reflect the vegetation, the grass and the trees and the shrubbery and the flowers. And this is not capable of being understood by the birds, and they try to reach these illusions of these images that are like the mirror on the window, and they collide. When they collide, they experience the same kind of injuries that we humans do when we have head injuries, head trauma, like picture yourself or someone you know, or just another human being in a car accident where their head hits the windshield. You know, your brain is in an enclosed space in your skull, and your brain tissue is about the consistency of a banana. And when your head strikes that windshield, or when a bird strikes the glass, the brain gets compressed, and the tissue responds by swelling, and to deal with this trauma. And when it swells, it breaks the blood vessels in the brain. And this is how people get strokes. This is how birds experience paralysis, and it results in their death. Even those that hit and strike and recover and fly off, the suspicion is that they also perish. And we know this from, again, birds that I've kept in captivity that have had collisions, and in their confinement and my protecting them, they still developed increased paralysis over time as a result of their injuries. So the suspicion is that, and homes that I monitored consistently and asked questions about who survived collisions, it turned out that 50% of those that struck were killed outright, and 50% flew away, most likely to die elsewhere, but some do survive, and we have records that they do survive as well.
Voy a traducir brevemente lo que acaba de decir el doctor Klem. Básicamente las aves golpean porque ellas no son capaces de percibir que el vidrio es un obstáculo, son engañadas por el reflejo y la transparencia, y al golpear, pues el golpe que tienen en el cráneo produce una inflamación del cerebro y les puede producir la muerte. Mayormente alrededor del 50% muere inmediatamente, y del 50% que se va volando, una gran cantidad también muere por la inflamación y por la hemorragia que ocurre. Voy a continuar ahora Well, I think you know what is this. No, what is this exhibition?
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason they do it is to show how serious is this problem. So
Yes.
please tell us how serious is this problem.
Oh, well, this particular image is in Toronto, on Canada, and every fall and spring, they gather together the birds that have died at the buildings in the downtown area, and they display them. It was in one of the government buildings for many years, and now they use the Royal Ontario Museum as their source of displaying this. And you can see the people in the background there that have come to see this issue. And of course, in recent times, as recently as this last year, there was a paper published in our journal, one of our prestigious journals in North America, The Science, in which habitat destruction and domestic cats and windows in buildings were cited as the major attrition rate to try to explain that 33% of the breeding birds in North America have been lost since the 1970s. And this particular issue has gained more and more importance as more and more studies have revealed who's vulnerable and how many animals are vulnerable. Again, think about it, right? I mean, think about what the problem is. The windows are, in a way, passive killers. They take the most fit members of the population, the strongest members of the population, as well as the weak ones, because the visual systems of birds just can't see the glass. So having the strong as well as the weak being lost in the populations are damaging those species, not only the ones that are common, but the ones that are rare and endangered. So all birds are vulnerable. Massive amounts, 1 billion birds just in the United States alone dies. Billions of birds worldwide die in this way from every part of the planet. Wherever you have a piece of glass and a bird together, you have victims. So the massive distribution of this threat, and every bird is a potential hazard, is a potential mortality. And the fact that windows and humans are building more and more buildings with more and more residences and commercial buildings and even zoos and visitor centers, they all are lavishly covered with glass. It just increases the danger for these birds in the world. And we are compelled, right, as humans, if we're going to be responsible for saving them, we have to change those windows into barriers that they will see so they won't become the unwitting and unwanted victims that they are now.
Estamos viendo en esta foto una exhibición que se hace o se hacía cada año para mostrar las víctimas de colisiones contra ventanas en Toronto. Y el doctor estaba comentando un poco sobre la magnitud del problema, señalando que las ventanas son asesinos pasivos. Básicamente las aves no son capaces de distinguirlas como obstáculos y al golpear mueren tanto aves que son, digamos, que son más, que tienen mejores genes, así como otras que tal vez tengan algunos problemas, pero todas son vulnerables a golpear contra ventanas. Entonces el problema es muy grande porque donde sea que existe una ventana con aves cerca, pues puede haber muertes, aunque no nos demos cuenta de esto. I just wanted to add a picture of some of the birds that also are victims here in Costa Rica. Estas son aves que fueron también colectadas aquí en Costa Rica para mostrar cómo aquí también se puede o se podría hacer una exhibición de las víctimas de este problema. I wanted to add this picture too. This is a coati, and just maybe you can talk a little bit how the carrion eaters can affect the people doing research about how big is this problem.
Right. Well, in North America, one of the early studies that I had done with some of my students was that we put out victims of these windows or simulated victims, and we learned, for example, that like the coati here in North America, we had cats and dogs and raccoons and skunks and opossums. They would learn that these birds were dying at the windows, and they would come and collect them. And they're very bright, and they know that there's food to be had. And so this adds a couple of problems to trying to convince people that this tragedies are happening, because these scavengers, these animals come and they'll collect the dead and dying. And remember before, for those animals that are not killed outright, when an animal is injured, it will often seek shelter. It'll hide. And humans, and you can tell whether it's in Costa Rica or Guatemala or Pennsylvania or Belgium or France, vegetation is placed around windows, and that vegetation hides the birds that crash into the windows. And these animals, coatis in particular, are very, very adept at finding injured birds and dead birds and taking them away. And so the threat that the windows pose to the animals are often hidden from human beings, and this makes it even more difficult to convince people that this is something that we have to be aware of and have to protect the animals.
Esta foto sirve para ilustrar un poquito del papel que los carroñeros pueden tener en este problema, porque como este episodio que vemos, muchos de ellos recogen las aves mientras están heridas, o igual pueden hacerlo los gatos y los perros, y dificultan que se vea la magnitud del problema. Pero además de los carroñeros, también muchas de las aves quedan sencillamente escondidas en la vegetación y por tanto no son visibles para las personas. Es difícil distinguir entonces qué tan grande es el problema. Okay. Now we are going to see some of the pictures, some of the birds that we found in Costa Rica that are considered vulnerable to this problem. You mentioned already that all birds may collide if they fly or are close to a window. They may collide with windows. So let's see what we found. Vamos a ver qué hemos encontrado aquí en Costa Rica sobre qué especies pueden ser más o menos vulnerables. Aquí en Costa Rica tenemos en este momento 276 especies que se han reportado. Los colibríes son los más abundantes. Dr. Klem, we found here in Costa Rica the most of the birds that collide with windows, not let's say that 50%, but at least like, let's say close to 20% are hummingbirds. Mm-hmm. And we wonder why they collide so often with windows. What do you think about this? I don't know if you have the same problem in the United States.
Well, we at least where I live in the eastern part of the United States, we only have one hummingbird that's a regular resident, and it is a frequent collision victim. That's the ruby-throated hummingbird. Out west, they have far larger numbers of species, 20 to 30 species of hummingbirds, and they're all on the sort of dead list. They all show up. But here's the deal, right? I mean, you have to have two things in common, right? I mean, to explain who gets killed, where, and how many get killed. One is the density of birds, what I call that enter into the danger zone. Like that I define as being 30 feet or 10 meters in front of the glass surface. And once the birds are attracted to a building or an area where a piece of glass is located, and it's within that danger zone, of course, remember the glass is invisible to them, so they become potential victims. And so how many birds are found in and around human dwellings? Hummingbirds in particular being attracted to flowers for feeding or feeders. These animals enter that danger zone rather easily, and they're available to being deceived. Any other, again, like I said earlier, and like you repeated, all birds, because of their visual system, are capable of being deceived by the glass. But what explains how many and who and how what large numbers of the selected species are involved is who gets attracted to these areas most often. And if there's lots of flowers and lots of feeding areas, there's a university campus in in Pennsylvania here, near the city of Philadelphia. And there was an ornithologist who was on the faculty there, and he monitored all of the nesting birds on the campus. And it turned out that the ruby-throated hummingbirds on that particular campus were all killed off. They were extirpated. All of them died, and there were no more nesting hummingbirds on that campus because they flew into the local windows.
Wow. Preguntaba al doctor Klem que por qué sería que los colibríes son tan vulnerables o golpean o son reportados tan a menudo por golpear contra ventanas. Y él menciona que mucho tiene que ver con que las aves estén cerca de lo que él llama el área de peligro, que es cerca de los ventanales. Y en el caso de los colibríes, ellos son atraídos por las flores que las personas siembran cerca de las ventanas, alrededor de las casas. Y pues se confunden con el reflejo de esas flores y por eso es que posiblemente golpean tanto. Pero cualquier ave que otra vez se acerque mucho a los ventanales, es atraída por recursos, puede ser susceptible para golpear contra ventanas. I included also this picture of the emerald toucanet because I studied their victims in the Monteverde area, and it was interesting to see that this species that is not everywhere in Costa Rica, but mostly maybe in this area and in the highlands, is a very common victim of collisions. Maybe it's because it's very abundant, who knows? But that's the case. Okay. Also, we have here an immature bellbird that collided on a window, and I wanted to mention too the problem with the birds that make altitudinal migration. They may be, let's say, they are born in some places, but then migrate to other altitudes. And this is the case of the bellbird. And well, I wanted to show you, this is an endangered species here in Costa Rica, but they have this activity. Un pájaro campana que golpeó en ventanas y que tiene una migración altitudinal. Muchos colibríes también la tienen. Well, I guess maybe they are also vulnerable because this behavior of going to highlands or lowlands. You know.
Yes.
Also, I want to show this picture because those were 3 individuals that hit at the same time, and 2 of them died. Is it common that entire flocks of birds collide at the same time in windows?
Well,
with windows?
For sure. You know, I have many records of birds being pursued, you know, being chased by birds of prey. And both the bird being chased as well as the bird of prey have flown into windows. I have records of 50 or more finch-like birds, dark-eyed juncos, hitting a single window during bad visibility, like in a snowstorm in Illinois. Here again, if you have the density of birds, whether it's individuals moving through or whether it's small numbers or whether it's whole flocks, they again go back to the same fundamental reason as to what makes them vulnerable, what makes the glass hazardous to them. They just don't see it. So if you think about walking, and again, in your hospitals in Costa Rica, as well as in North America here, there are many people that go to be treated in the hospital because they've walked into glass doors or glass walls. Now, most humans do that because they're not paying attention to where they're going. They're talking or they're distracted. But if they were paying attention, they would see the handle on the glass door, or they might see a sticker that indicates to them that it's a wall. But in the case of the bird, all they have to do is see just a tiny little spot of light, and they become confused, and they don't see the glass in the same context that we do. And they're, as a result, they're more often fatal collisions, whereas humans have died from walking into glass, but it's a very, very rare event.
El doctor Klem nos comenta como, bueno, cuando golpean varias aves, que no es algo tan extraño, pueden golpear 2 individuos, 3 individuos, o incluso un grupo completo de aves, que eso no es inusual, y nos recuerda que, bueno, finalmente la razón por la que ellos golpean es porque no ven el vidrio, y incluso las personas también pueden tener serios problemas con esto y ir a hospitales. Es decir, no es que las aves tengan menos capacidades que las personas, sencillamente hay mayor posibilidad de que golpeen porque no pueden distinguir el vidrio, y podría pasar lo mismo con las personas si tuviéramos más paredes de vidrio a nuestro alrededor. Just this last week and this week we had several reports of migratory birds. Those are some of them: a summer tanager and a Swainson's thrush.
Mm-hmm.
And this is typical in this time of the year, of course. I don't know if it's this time of the year already the migration finished in the United States, or they continue migrating. I'm not really sure about this.
Oh, there's migration is still going on, but the bulk of it has left, right? The bird specialists who study these things tell us, and the general knowledge is about 5 billion birds of about 200 species leave North America and pass on migration to Central and South America, to Costa Rica and elsewhere. And these 2 species are among them. I wanted to mention briefly too, when you were talking earlier about the bellbirds and their altitudinal migration, it turns out that, again, lots of studies, and we have to always remember that every species of bird, just like every species of mammal, has its own history, its own evolutionary history. And so we have to be mindful of the uniqueness of every life form and how they came to be and what their habits and practices are. But a general theme regarding migration is fidelity, meaning they use similar routes. And if birds are using similar routes, and then we humans build buildings and place this invisible barrier called glass in their way, they become vulnerable to being deceived and die as a result. One incident which I wanted to share was that in where I live, there was a local resident that called me up and told me that they had built what was called a sunroom. It was an all glass room that was an extension onto their home. And when that room was built, in the very first year, 24 black-capped chickadees, which are small birds belonging to the family parity, they hit and were killed at this window. The next year, maybe 11 birds died. And the following year, maybe 7 birds died. And the following year, 2 birds died. And then there were no more birds dying at that window. And one suspects that this particular population of animals were migrating through this area, just like the altitudinal migrations that occur in Costa Rica and elsewhere, and they were following the same paths. And when that building was built and that invisible barrier was placed in their passageway, they weren't able to tell the difference, and they kept on dying to the point where there were no more birds to die. And you can see how healthy populations can be decimated. They can be reduced to the level at which there are no longer any individuals to carry on. So these migrants, strikingly, are dying just as frequently in North America along their passage route as they are when they get to Costa Rica. In fact, they're dying all along their migratory route. And I like to point out too that it's very important to realize that the nature of the threat that the windows pose to these animals make it indiscriminate as a killer. They take, again, the strongest as well as the weak members of the population. And we really just can't afford to have our stronger individuals be dying by these indiscriminate killings, because those are the animals we rely on. Now, well, I want to stop there because I don't want to talk about too many different things. But one thing that maybe we can discuss is what happens with natural populations and how do they maintain their health? Because some years more birds will die of starvation or they'll die of predators. And the the populations are able to rebound. They're able to come back. They're able to make up for those losses. But in the case of the windows, they're taking the very animals that we're relying on to make up. And it's an additive mortality factor instead of one that the animals are able to compensate for, which makes it extremely important for us to realize how insidious and how harmful these losses are to the natural populations.
Hay varias ideas que comunicó el doctor Klem, pero tal vez quisiera mencionar algunas de ellas. Una de ellas es la fidelidad que tienen las aves migratorias a sus rutas de migración. Él comentaba de un sitio donde construyeron como una especie de solar, con un edificio de solo vidrio, y como en un primer año murieron, digamos que 20 aves, al siguiente 10, al siguiente 5, y como poco a poco golpeaban menos, pero era porque ellos estaban siguiendo su ruta de migración. Entonces, cada edificio nuevo que se construye, básicamente va a matar a una cantidad de aves que acostumbraba a pasar por ahí. Y él también resaltaba la importancia de que las aves que mueren no son necesariamente las más débiles o enfermas, como podría pasar con el caso de un gato o un depredador, sino los fuertes también, porque sencillamente no son capaces de reconocer a las ventanas, no fueron, digamos que evolucionaron para eso, de manera que mueren también los individuos que son más fuertes o tienen mejor capacidad para sobrevivir. Okay, just I wanted to add to this picture to show that not only like warblers or thrush or hummingbirds, but also nocturnal species also collide, and also hawks and many other different kind of species also collide. And I'm going to say to people, if they want to see other species that people have sent information, is in that link below there in Costa Rica. Okay, so now we can talk about windows and which kind of buildings are more dangerous to birds or not. Something that I noticed is that we in Costa Rica, many times we put this layer to make the window look darker, so the sun is not so hard or so strong, and we call that polarizado, vidrios polarizados. But I noticed that many times birds collide with this kind of glass. What do you think? Are they more dangerous to birds than clear glass?
Well, in our country, in the United States anyway, in the southern states, from Florida to Mississippi to Alabama to Louisiana, the intensity is not as tropical as it is in Costa Rica, where you're closer, or Central America in general, and where you're closer to the equator. But it still is intense. My daughter lives in Florida, and the 90-degree temperatures in the 30 degrees centigrade is quite common there. And so to try to lessen the demand for air conditioning or other energy sources, they put these films on the window like you're describing here. And in many cases, those films just enhance the reflectivity of the glass, which makes them even more of an illusion to the birds, and they end up perishing by striking them. So if these films are placed on the windows for the purpose of protecting heat gain and energy, and if they have patterns applied to them that will alert the birds to the danger, that can help mitigate or lessen the danger of that particular window for the birds. But in general, remember that all windows are potentially harmful to birds. What explains which ones are more harmful than others has everything to do with the environment that surrounds that window. If it was just concrete and there was a window in the center, there's not much to attract birds to that kind of habitat of just bare concrete. But if plantings are placed there or trees, there are many, many, many accounts that I have where the very just presence of one piece of vegetation helps to explain birds that fly into the windows nearby. One of the examples I often use is that I had a colleague who worked at our Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and they built a new building that had a whole wall of glass. And when this person would go to work, they would walk along the wall of glass and pick up birds almost at random along the whole length of the building. But then they planted trees every 30 feet, every 10 meters in front of the glass. And when that person walked along the same glass wall, they only found the birds near where the trees were. Because there again, the trees are attracting the birds to perch. Now they're next to the danger zone, and they leave the tree and fly into the glass because it's reflected as if they're going into another tree. So these films have a way of enhancing the illusion, enhancing the danger.
Okay. Le comentaba al doctor Klem cómo aquí en Costa Rica utilizamos lo que se llama el vidrio polarizado y cómo me ha llamado la atención ver aves que golpean contra el vidrio. Él mencionaba que en Estados Unidos hay sitios donde podrían utilizar algo parecido, pero que no debemos olvidar que tiene que también tomarse en cuenta lo que hay alrededor del vidrio, los ventanales. En este caso, este tipo de film o de adhesivo puede aumentar, digamos, la ilusión o el reflejo, la calidad del reflejo de lo que hay alrededor. Pero si lo que hay alrededor son, por ejemplo, árboles, eso va a aumentar también el peligro para las aves, porque ellos van a ver como que hay un sitio donde pueden llegar a comer o a refugiarse. Entonces, el vidrio polarizado aumenta o posiblemente aumenta el peligro para las aves, pero si hay vegetación cerca, también va a ser más peligroso también esta situación. Also, I wanted to include this, all these windows that I'm showing you, people sent because there was a bird that collided there. And do you think that windows that are located a little high, for example, 10 meters high, are more dangerous to birds? Well, maybe you mentioned that all windows are, but yeah. I don't know if, yeah.
Well, here again, right? I mean, yes, all windows are dangerous, but where what species are attracted to what human structures and what part of the environment they occupy and where the windows are located are all factors in explaining why a particular window might be more dangerous for a particular species under a particular condition. Like when I did my original studies, my fundamental studies, I asked the question, you know, at particular buildings that were monitored for a year and a half continuously, you know, at what heights do collisions occur? Well, most of them occurred at ground level within the first, say, 10 meters above the ground. And further studies revealed that the greatest vulnerability ranges anywhere from ground level up to about 4 stories high, like 52 feet or 16 meters into the sky. And this is largely related, associated with vegetation like trees that grow at that height. It doesn't mean that at higher high rises, like I have records of gulls and others that are hitting 24th, 25th, you know, 30 stories up windows and crashing into them and dying. But it's a relatively rare event. Most birds are attracted again to the vegetation and the perching sites that are at lower levels, up to 4 stories, 16 meters. And it's these windows that we seek to modify, to make them more visible so birds would be protected. So another thing too is, for sure, studies, my own and others, have revealed that the more glass, meaning the more area of glass that's on the surface of a building, the more hazard there is for the animals. But it doesn't mean that there's a magic number. It turns out that small little tiny windows that where you place your automobile in a garage, they're just as deadly as an entire wall of glass on a single building. It's just that the bigger wall of glass on the ceiling of a single building has more area to do more damage to more individuals than that small little tiny window. They're equally hazardous. They're equally dangerous. They're equally lethal. But just having more area for the animals to be deceived in makes common sense to predict that you're going to have more deaths. And that's what we find.
Le preguntaba al doctor si las ventanas altas son más peligrosas. Él mencionaba que en sus estudios había encontrado que muchas de las colisiones ocurrían casi que al nivel del suelo. Luego también encontró que hasta los 10 metros de altura, pero eso coincidía con la altura de los árboles, lo cual indicaba que a la altura donde estaban las aves moviéndose, pues ahí es donde estaban golpeando también. También el doctor menciona que una ventana pequeña puede ser igualmente peligrosa para las aves que una ventana muy grande porque igual puede engañarlas. Sin embargo, el hecho que aumente el área del vidrio hace que aumente también el área donde ellos se pueden confundir o engañar por el reflejo. Entonces, es una cuestión como de lógica pensar que eso puede pasar. Vamos a seguir. This window, one in front of the other, they are also like dangerous for birds.
Yes,
more than others. Yeah.
Well, here again, I think it depends on the details of the surrounding environment. But for sure, whenever you have clear panes of glass where passing, around a room or a corridor between buildings, and vegetation can be seen on the other side, the animals, we know from studies that, birds are in flight or when they try to reach a tree line or vegetation, their vision is at a distance. And so they're trying to reach habitat that they see through this glass, but they don't concentrate on the glass itself. Not only can they not see the glass, but even if it was dirty or marked, many of them still collide with it because their vision is looking at the vegetation that's behind the clear panes.
Okay. Este ejemplo, digamos, de una ventana que luce como un túnel o un corredor, lo hace también peligroso para las aves porque las aves ven lo que hay detrás, que en este caso es vegetación. Y entonces, aparentemente las aves, aunque el vidrio esté un poquito sucio o que tenga unas marcas pequeñitas, se enfoca más en lo que hay detrás. Por tanto, puede ser bastante peligrosa para las aves y van a golpear contra ellas. Well, here in Costa Rica, we have more and more buildings with big panes of glass like this. So maybe it's what you mentioned before about the area that is increasing.
Yeah.
And there's also similar to what you were mentioning, like a bridge. Is that what you call it?
Right. Yes. Yes.
Right.
A corridor or a linkway, they call it. They call it linkways in Canada because they're bringing together two buildings. Or in the US, we more or less use the term corridor, a passageway between buildings.
Okay. So now let's talk about
and I might
yep,
point out, no, that's okay, that these linkways that are raised above like 2 or 3 stories, there's a species of bird, it's like a shorebird, but it lives in the forest in North America called the American woodcock. And it migrates at lower elevations, lower altitude, like 300 meters or above the ground. And it brings them in direct contact and they get killed disproportionately at these linkways joining buildings. I found many of them underneath these like passageways as a result of them migrating during the day and even to some degree at dawn and dusk. And it makes them vulnerable to these glass lined walls. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. The only problem is that I don't know the name of the species in Spanish, but
anyway.
Oh,
yeah, it's okay. It's
don't
okay.
worry. So, but I'm going to translate. No, estaba mencionando que estos corredores que conectan edificios, que son un tipo de pasadizos, pueden ser bastante peligrosos para las aves. Y una especie en particular que él mencionó muere en cantidades considerables porque ellos migran durante el día a la misma altura en la que se encuentran estos corredores, y como ellos tienen vidrios que están frente a frente, no ven el vidrio, no ven otra vez el obstáculo y mueren en cantidades grandes.
This bird is related to the snipes, if you have snipes in Costa Rica.
What was the name again?
The bird in North America that dies at these sites are called American woodcock, but it's like a snipe. It's like a bird that's found in a marshy area.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we are going to talk about how to prevent bird window collisions. And so I'm going to show methods to prevent, and we can discuss briefly each one. Let's start with the most known and popular method that are silhouettes. And again, this is a picture here in Costa Rica with these silhouettes. So what will you say about it?
Okay. Well, when I started studying this problem in the 1970s, our, again, prestigious museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian, sold a hawk silhouette like this to keep birds from flying into windows. And so I knew about that and I purchased one, and it was my very first experiment. And what I found was that a single silhouette, like on the window that you have here on one pane, really was very little help. Birds hit still the windows, but around the silhouette. And the silhouette itself, even though it was of a hawk, wasn't really frightening birds away. It prevented birds from striking the windows that the silhouette was covering, that part of the window, but not the other parts. And so what these experiments resulted in me then asking the question, what would I have to do to put silhouettes of how many numbers on the window that the bird would see the window as a barrier to stay away? And that ended up being that I had to take silhouette patterns and put them every 2 inches apart if I was going to orient them across the window like in a row, in a horizontal row. But if I put the silhouettes in vertical columns, I could afford to separate them by 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So the silhouettes in and of themselves as fearful animals or predators are not effective preventing bird strikes. But if you put enough of them on the window, but you could use other shapes as well, diamonds, circles, lines, any of these things work as long as you separate them. And this separation pattern has been referred to as a 2x4 rule or a 2x2 rule, talking about English inches. But 5x10 rule, 5 centimeters or 10 centimeter distances between them work just as well. And because of the number of hummingbirds that die in Costa Rica and really elsewhere in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, the current advocate is to have these patterns, again, whether it's these silhouettes or whether it's some other shape, like a triangle, have them 2 inches apart, both sideways, horizontally, as well as vertically, to alert the hummingbird that this is danger zone and not to fly through.
Okay. Hablábamos un poquito sobre qué tan efectivas son las siluetas de aves para prevenir las colisiones. Él comentaba que uno de los primeros experimentos que hizo fue utilizar estas siluetas y ver qué tan efectivas eran, y en realidad no lo eran porque las aves golpeaban a la par, donde no estaba la silueta, sino el vidrio a la par de ellas. Entonces él se dio cuenta que la forma para que fueran efectivas sería colocándolas muy cerca una de la otra, y de ahí viene una regla que él llama algo así como 2 por 4 en pulgadas, pero en centímetros serían 5 centímetros por 10 centímetros, de manera que dejen poco espacio entre lo que sea que se coloca en el vidrio, ya sean siluetas, círculos, cuadros, franjas, cualquier cosa que las aves detecten como un obstáculo. Pero las siluetas, aunque sean rapaces, aunque sean cualquier cosa que asuste a las aves, realmente no las asusta tanto como para evitar que ellas golpeen donde está el reflejo. Also, some buildings here have this kind of glass, like how do you say that?
Angled
Glass. So do you think that is effective to prevent collisions?
One of my early, again, experiments, I studied this angling. Only you see the way this glass is angled upward. I first asked the question if it was angled the other way, so that when you looked at the glass, you would see a reflection of the ground. And when I first did this experiment, I thought, well, this will probably protect birds because they're not really accustomed to flying onto the ground. When the glass is installed in a conventional way, it's vertical and it reflects the facing habitat in the sky. And when I did the experiment of the angled glass, again, opposite to what is depicted here, what I found is that the angling didn't protect the birds. They still flew into the glass. But what did protect them was that instead of flying into the straight up and down glass, perpendicular, they were flying into it and they were being deflected. Their force was being lessened. The velocity and the speed with which they hit was being softened, less dangerous for them. And so many more birds survived in angled glass than they did in vertical glass. But it wasn't for the reason that I thought it was. It wasn't because they would see the ground and judge that it wasn't something to fly into. It had everything to do with the angled glass protecting them from the momentum with which they hit.
Uh-huh. Muchas personas preguntan si el hecho de que el vidrio esté inclinado, ya sea hacia arriba como en este caso o hacia abajo, podría prevenir o ayudar a que las aves no mueran. El doctor mencionaba que él investigó en el caso cuando el vidrio estaba inclinado hacia abajo, esperando que el hecho de que reflejara el suelo hiciera que las aves evitaran viajar hacia el ventanal, pero se dio cuenta que no, si bien sobrevivían más aves cuando golpeaban con este tipo de vidrio inclinado, no era por las razones que él esperaba, que era que sencillamente evitaran las colisiones, sino era porque al golpear el vidrio que está inclinado así, suavizaba un poco el golpe y por tanto eran menos letales, digamos, las colisiones. Okay, these are chords. I know that in the United States you call it acopian bird savers. This is in San Vito Cotobruz in Costa Rica. What do you say? Do you think they will be effective to prevent collisions?
Oh, for sure they are, yes. Again, they follow the 2x4 rule. These look like to be 10 centimeters apart, so there's probably still some risk for hummingbirds, but most birds will be protected by these cords at this distance, this uniformity.
Ok. Estos ventanas son una foto de Jardín Wilson, el San Vito de Cotobruz, y le preguntaba qué tan efectivas eran las cuerdas para prevenir las colisiones, y él mencionaba que estas paredes están separadas como unos 10 centímetros y podrían ser bastante efectivas, quizás no tanto para aves pequeñas como los colibríes, pero aún así muchas aves van a evitar golpear contra las ventanas. Okay, this is a method that was created by a friend that is Gaby Vargas, and she decided to implement that in her house. And so she located this kind of like, how do you say that? Adhesivos, film, sandblasting. and yeah, it's separated also around like 10 centimeters, something like that. Okay, so it probably helps a little bit. Yeah,
it's effective, yes?
Yeah, yes, effective, yes. And then this is our paint. This is in Monteverde. I think you know that one.
Yes, I've been there, yes. Beautiful, very beautiful.
So, right, that will be helpful. Then.
Yep, yes.
And what do you call that in the United States? We call it parasoles.
Let's see. Not awnings, but I can't think of what you call them now, but they're like blinds.
Right.
They call them blinds, but these are exterior, and
Right.
so grating or coverings. There's the famous newspaper in the United States, the New York Times, grills. They also call them. They put these grills in front of their glass windows at the New York Times building in New York City. And it's very effective in preventing bird collisions because the birds don't, they land on these or they're alerted to this danger. And so it's a very visual obstacle that they're able to recognize and stay away.
Yeah, those are used here to avoid the sun to be very strong again.
Yes.
And we call it it helps to reduce the heat inside of the building. Estamos hablando de los parasoles y mencionando que sí pueden ser muy efectivos para evitar que las aves se golpeen, aunque fueron creados para reducir un poquito la cantidad de luz que entra dentro del edificio, son muy efectivos para evitar las colisiones. And here in Costa Rica, we have a lot this kind of.
If I could say something about the solar panel, the paneling that you showed there, this is so effective. And why? Because it's on the outside of the window, right? And there are many patternings like this that are sold and placed on the inside of the window. And when they're inside of the window, when the sun is shining so that it reveals the pattern to both humans as well as birds on the outside, they're effective. But at many other times of the day, the outside of the window reflects and hides that patterning. And so the window becomes hazardous for the birds. But this application here with these awnings and these grills on the outside of the window, that's to be encouraged. That's to be favored. That's more effective. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's all right. Estaba mencionando como algunos otros métodos conforme cambia la luz en el día, pueden ser un poquito escondidos, no ser tan efectivos, dependiendo cómo la luz esté afectando la ventana. En cambio, estos son muy evidentes para las aves y por tanto debería favorecerse mucho el uso para evitar las colisiones. Yeah, and so I was mentioning about this. They are used to avoid like the thieves to go and steal things.
Yeah.
But they are very common here in Costa Rica too.
Yeah, and there is they're as effective as the cords are. Again, as long as the spacing, meets the criteria of 10 centimeters vertically or smaller distance, they're going to be effective for sure.
Yeah. Ellos son bastante efectivos si mantienen una distancia. Tal vez hacer una énfasis en el tema de la distancia. Yo tengo reportes de personas que han enviado fotos de aves que golpearon, aunque tuvieran cuerdas o que tuvieran barras, pero la distancia entre las cuerdas y las barras era muy grande y las aves aún intentaban pasar entre ellas. Entonces hay que considerar mucho la distancia para evitar las colisiones. Ojalá sean 10 centímetros o menos todavía. I was saying about how important is the distance between the bars. Okay, please tell me what is going on. I know that long time ago we were talking about the UV products to prevent collisions. Is there a new product to prevent collisions with UV?
There are additional manufacturers that are working on producing products. And some of them are very large, major glass manufacturers. There are some products currently available that are known to be effective, but it's very difficult to apply the ultraviolet patterns on new glass, on novel, on inorganic glass. If you take ultraviolet patterns that humans don't see, but birds do, and you apply them with films, they're far more effective. So the products that are currently available for remodeling and new construction might reduce, according to, again, some of my experiments, they'll reduce the strike rate or the mortality rate by 70%. But the same product in a film that uses ultraviolet signals can reduce it by 95 or close to 100%. The problem, though, is that the manufacturers who I've worked with to produce the films that do such a good job, just like to retrofit buildings or even put it on new ones, they haven't committed to making it commercially available. They don't really understand how much they're going to get back on their investment, and they don't believe that there's going to be that much interest. I try every day that I can and take the opportunity to tell them that that's not true, that there would be a great deal of interest. But so far, just a select group of major glass manufacturers have produced some ultraviolet windows, and they're being sold and used, and they're attractive again. And why? Because the so-called visual patterns are not necessary. You're not going to see the ultraviolet patterns as a human, but the birds will see it and avoid it. So it still has a lot of promise. There's a new film that just came out. There was a paper published on it from Austria. And the hope is that this will gain some interest as well. But it turns out that there's some important issues here. You have to have the reflection of the ultraviolet be strong enough. And it has to be contrasted with absorbing areas of ultraviolet. And it has to be over a certain wavelength of 300 to 400 nanometers. And you have to meet all of these criteria to give the bird a chance to be able to see that signal to alert it to the danger. And having all these combinations, you have to remember that before this topic came into interest, and when manufacturers wanted to do something about it, when they placed coatings on their glass, their whole purpose was to do it for energy reasons, to keep out the heat or to reflect the heat. And the coatings that they put on the glass were uniform. There was no disturbance in the coating. And now, people like you and I, we're trying to tell the world that there has to be a disturbance. There has to be reflection and absorption so the animals will be able to see it. You know, I like to always point out to people, you know, like we think we look at the world through our eyes, but really our eyes just gather the wavelengths of light and they transform it into electricity, and our brain is what's really doing the seeing. And so trying to get the brain of the bird to be able to see these things in a way that they'll be able to respond and be protected is a challenge, because the products that we make, especially with the glass, it doesn't have the ability, like the film does, for example, to be more noisy, be more effective, be more visual to the animals so they can be protected. So it's still, there are products, but there's relatively few of them right now. And what products are available are not as effective as the visual signals are, like the cords or the tape or the paintings.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Es que hace muchos años cuando comencé a estudiar este tema, había mucha esperanza de que se produjeran vidrios que reflejaran los rayos ultravioleta, porque las aves pueden ver ese rango de luz y nosotros no. Entonces, la gente que quiere ver a través de las ventanas iba a tener la ventaja de que podía ver perfectamente a través, y las aves sí iban a poder detectar que había una barrera ahí. Sin embargo, comenta el doctor que si bien hay productos que se han creado, pues no están disponibles tanto para las aves, para evitar las colisiones, porque no creen los que los producen que son comercialmente interesantes, digamos, que mucha gente los va a comprar. Y por otra parte, tienen que tener ciertas características que hay que considerar, como por ejemplo que haya un contraste entre la absorción de la luz ultravioleta y el reflejo de manera que haya un contraste que las aves puedan detectar como una especie de realmente una barrera. Así que en este momento hay muy pocos productos y no están disponibles realmente y no son tal vez tan efectivos como las cuerdas, como las barras u otros que hemos presentado hasta este momento. Okay, so just we are almost finishing, but I would like to know how is people organizing in the United States or and other countries, maybe like Canada, to deal with this problem. Right now, people know that there are a lot of birds that are dying because of bird window collisions. So how is people organizing? What are they doing, like in general?
Yeah. Well, there are organizations that have historical interest in this topic. One of them is the Fatal Light Awareness Program in Toronto, and they've been very successful as a group in not only in their own city, but across the entire country of Canada, in interesting cities and managers and planners to produce guides for building zones and regulations, and that's growing. And they've interested legal people to try to use laws that are protecting the birds to guide and really stimulate commercial development of bird-friendly buildings. So you have organizations like this FLAP organization. They in turn have stimulated other organizations in the capital city of Ottawa in Canada. There's Wings Ottawa. That's another organization that has modeled their effort to try to save birds from buildings off of FLAP. And the United States has been also stimulated by these groups, arguably that got their start in earnest on this topic in Canada, but have spread throughout the United States. And some of our more visible and noteworthy conservation organizations like the Audubon Society and the American Birding Association have championed their members and made campaigns to try to bring this issue to the attention of the general public and influence legislators as well as common citizens to protect the birds. So when I started studying this topic 46 years ago, nobody was interested in listening. Now, many people have saw the importance of this topic for saving these animals, and they're organizing themselves. And the latest, even though we have laws in North America, both in Mexico and the United States and Canada, that we cooperate to protect these animals, at the federal level, it's been very difficult because it's complicated. So the current movement is to have municipalities, cities like San Jose or elsewhere, that would take it under their authority to guide buildings so that and architects, so that they'll be aware of this issue and to build structures that will be safe for these animals. As we all know, like I like to point out, climate change is a very serious problem the world over, but it's a very, very complex problem. Here is a conservation issue where birds are deceived by the glass. We humans can solve that problem. We just need to cooperate and convince people that it's worthy of their attention and it's a worthy cause. And so I think it's an uplifting story. It started slow, but it's increasing. And every year that goes by, more and more people, because of these organizations and just citizens in general, once they become aware of it, are doing what they can to get their governments, their local governments, to enact laws to make their buildings safe. So I'm very optimistic, and I think that those groups and citizens, and I know, Rosemary, you've been involved in encouraging and asking citizens, and we call them citizen scientists, to be party to your work and your research. And in the United States, we're doing similar things. And so I'm very, very thrilled and excited that you've and your group pays attention to this topic, and it's growing, right? I mean, I hear more studies in Mexico, more studies in Brazil, more studies in Costa Rica. So these are, and remember that this topic and this bird vulnerability is worldwide. you may not hear much of it from Australia, but birds are dying in Australia. They're dying in Europe. They're dying in China. They're dying in Singapore. They're dying around the world. In fact, there's a fellow from the FLAP organization and a doctoral student at Western Ontario University, and he just recently solicited information about birds flying into windows from literally around the world. And he is overloaded with messages that come in, just reinforcing the prediction that wherever you have birds in glass, you're going to have these tragedies. And so it's, as I like to point out, right, it doesn't matter how much effort is being put into solving the problem, whether there's none or whether there's a great deal, the problem is not going to go away. The nature of the animals not being able to see the glass is not going to go away. There's going to be continuous harm unless we do something about it. So I think the good news is that more people are doing more things, and we're hopeful that we're going to preserve these animals in the future.
Good, thank you. Ok, no, le preguntaba al doctor cómo se está organizando la gente en Estados Unidos y otros países. Él mencionaba algunas organizaciones que han estado trabajando en este tema y han logrado cosas bastante buenas e importantes a nivel mucho de los gobiernos locales, pero también ya introduciendo cosas en lo que es la legislación. Y entonces el doctor está bastante optimista porque cada año él ve que más y más personas prestan atención a este problema. Y él piensa que está haciendo un cambio, incluyendo aquí en Costa Rica, donde gracias a la colaboración de tantas personas conocemos hoy más esta situación. Y aprovecho para agradecer a todas las personas que colaboran con reportes, con fotografía de este tema, porque así es como hemos podido conocer más qué está pasando. I think that is maybe the last question. What would you suggest we should study? What are the questions right now that we should be focusing? Or there are not more questions left and we should just acting? What do you say?
No, I say that there's always room for additional study and information. We know that the problem for birds is universal, but we don't know which species are being affected in what proportion or disproportion. If your bellbirds are having such a terrible time maintaining their populations in the country, what part is the window issue playing in that? And what can we do to protect them better along their migratory route or what's happening? And what is the proportion? Like one thing that I remember being astounded at and really found spellbinding and of interest in your work, as well as some of the work in Mexico and elsewhere, is the remarkable number of resident species that are vulnerable, as opposed to like in North America here, for many, many decades, people thought that just the migrants were being killed. But they weren't, of course. All birds around human dwellings were being killed. It's just that when birds were migrating in North America, those 5 billion individuals of the 200 species that are moving north and south in the fall and the spring, they're the ones that are going through the cities, and they're the ones that are being killed where the reporters live and where people see them, and they're coming to the attention. But the resident birds, like the chickadees and the titmice and so on, they're being killed too, but they're just not as evident. And so which birds in what proportion, explained by their natural history, make them more vulnerable? That kind of study can be done in Costa Rica and around the world. And I think it's one that needs to be done. And we need to know what the factors are that make the respective species more or less vulnerable to these kinds of things. When I was first doing my study, people would say, well, like, for example, we didn't talk about this, but I have records of over now 30% of all the birds in North America, right? Over 1,000 species being that strike windows. Well, who are the ones that are not on the dead list, right? Who are the ones that are not being killed? Those are the ones that are not found in and around human dwellings. So if we have knowledge about animals that are changing their distribution patterns, are they becoming more urban, more suburban? Are they staying in more rural areas? We're going to be in a position to predict they might become more vulnerable to this particular hazard. And so having or encouraging our citizens and our cooperators, whether they're formal or informal naturalists, to be party to paying attention of who's getting killed where, at what time of the year, is still fundamentally valuable information.
Muy bien. El doctor mencionaba que todavía sigue siendo un tema de gran importancia saber qué tanto afecta este problema a las diferentes especies. Por ejemplo, en el caso del pájaro campana, sabemos que está golpeando contra ventanas y muriendo, pero qué tanto afecta al que esté en este momento considerado como una especie amenazada. Y así tantas otras especies para poder saber exactamente qué tanto les afecta dependiendo de su historia natural y demás. Son temas importantes para estudiar todavía en la mayor parte de los países, incluyendo Costa Rica. Son cosas que vale la pena estudiar. Okay, so just maybe some general, like main ideas, and then I will look to see if there are questions in the Facebook group. So I don't know if what are your conclusions? Maybe.
Well, I think, you know, what we've talked about in a rather informal but informative way is that this is a universal threat, and no country is going to be immune as long as there are buildings, and this hazard being the universal threat that it is only going to increase, because glass is a product that architects and engineers and others find fascinating. It's because of its ability to be produced in relatively cheap costs, and its aesthetic appeal is great. And so we can only predict in the future that more and more glass is going to be used in our buildings. And it's our responsibility, given what we know about these fundamental principles of the vulnerability of these animals universally to it, to make sure that those buildings are built in a safe way for the animals that we care so much about. We could talk all night long about the value that birds offer to human beings, from the spreading of seeds to harmful insects that are being consumed. We could talk about the services that they provide us and the recreation that people come, the people that I know, thousands upon thousands of colleagues of mine go to Costa Rica because of the diversity of the bird life that you have, and they enjoy trekking in your national parks and everywhere. This is billions of dollars worth of revenue in the United States just from birding interests alone. So to preserve these animals, these creatures that have such beauty and such value to us, is our imperative responsibility. And so as a conclusion, I would just say, look at, I think we've studied this long enough to know that this glass, whether it's reflection or clear, is a universal hazard. We know that we can change it into something that's safe for birds. We just have to convince our fellow humans that this is worthy, and we have to get the building professionals, the architects and the developers and those people who are putting up these glass-covered buildings to be convinced that they can offer a little bit more effort and a little bit more money to save their lives. You know, there's a famous, and again, I'll stop here as a story, but there's this famous building that's been built in our state of Minnesota in the capital, Minneapolis. It's a American football, right, stadium. And it's a mirrored huge building, a very attractive building, but really it slaughters birds. And long before the building was built, the plans were laid before the public, and it was predicted that this was going to happen. And the amount of money to make the glass safe was judged to be too much to invest in making the windows protect the birds. But now that the building has been built, now that the birds are being slaughtered, it's going to cost more money to try to change that glass, to protect those animals by law that are required to be protected. And so I think, again, like most problems in life, we may not all have the same good fortune to be exposed to the information, but education, right? Your university, my school, this is our best hope. education is not to be thought of as being for haves and have-nots, for high-class people or low-class people. It's for sharing, for the goodness of us all. In this case, the goodness of the birds. So I can't be more enthusiastic about trying to be respectful to every human being on the planet and ask them to cooperate, to learn, and to be party to not just saving the lives of these birds, but the other living creatures on the planet that we rely on as living creatures to survive together.
Okay. Le preguntaba al doctor por algunas conclusiones. Él menciona que, bueno, es evidente que este problema de la colisión de aves contra ventanas es un problema global, ocurre en todas partes, en todos los países, que además de que es global, va a tender a crecer porque los arquitectos y la gente en general ve los edificios como con mucho vidrio, como algo muy estético, muy atractivo, muy bello, y eso va a hacer que aumente la cantidad de colisiones contra ventanas. Entonces, ya en este punto ya se sabe que esta es una amenaza para las aves, y sabemos también la importancia que tienen las aves en el aspecto de ecología, todos los servicios ecosistémicos que brindan, y en el caso de países como el nuestro, como Costa Rica, toda la importancia que tiene a nivel de turismo ornitológico que ha crecido a través de los años, y por tanto que deberíamos de ser responsables y tratar de prevenir las colisiones y las muertes de las aves, y esto lo digo yo, no el doctor necesariamente, tener la oportunidad de dar el ejemplo a otros destinos ornitológicos de que realmente estamos protegiendo a estos seres que pues para muchas personas básicamente les dan de comer cuando vienen los turistas de otros países a verlos. Y concluye el doctor Klem hablando de la importancia de la educación de todas las personas sobre estos temas. Voy ahora a dejar de compartir la pantalla y voy a buscar now I'm going to look if there is any question about this conversation. Let me see. If there is not, it will be all right. Let me see. 1 minute, please. Okay. So there is a person saying that she tried a mixture of like a detergent with water to make a paste and spread it with a sponge on the glass, and it seems like it worked. So would you say that it may work?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. I remember one of the earlier zoo in Chicago, Illinois. Every time the migration season came upon them, they would make soap and they would put it on their windows. And it of course, it's a visual marker that the birds are able to recognize and stay away. So any kind of paste or application like that, just like paint, like you showed that one wonderful images on the one conservation building that we saw near Monteverde, that same kind of effect. Yeah.
Great. So, entonces el mezclar detergente o jabón con agua y con una esponja, distribuirlo sobre el vidrio, parece que funciona parcialmente o bastante bien. Él menciona que en un lugar que conoce se utilizaba bastante. Tengo que disculparme porque por alguna razón que yo no desconozco, usualmente no puedo ver más que 4 comentarios de los que la gente colocó. Entonces, si hay más preguntas, en realidad no puedo incluirlas aquí para hacérselas al doctor. Pero realmente yo espero que lo que hemos hablado sea de interés y sobre todo que les haya brindado información nueva e interesante. Doctor, there are more comments, but I don't know why I only can see 4 of them in Facebook. It's something new. So maybe there are more questions, and then maybe I'm going to ask you later for the answers.
Sure.
But thank you very much for everything that you share, and I'm going to share the video of this in other groups, so more people will see it later too. So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to say something like to conclude again.
just how honored I feel that you invited me to carry on this conversation and just sharing our mutual interests in a worthy cause. I really feel unbelievably privileged, and I thank you for the opportunity. And I wish all of your members and all of us in conservation the very best, for the very best reasons.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Klem. And say hi to Renee, and thank you everybody that listened to this conversation.
Thank you all.
Very good night. Goodbye.
Goodbye now.
Good night. Good night.